Our first example of active transport is going to be protein pumps. And what they do, we call primary active transport. And the reason that we say primary active transport is because these protein pumps use ATP directly. So let's draw this out. So I made a simplified version of the membrane here. This circle inside of the membrane, that is our protein pump. And I'm going to say that this top space is outside of the cell, and this bottom space is inside the cell. And so what this protein pump is going to do is pull in potassium ions, so K+, and it's going to push out sodium ions. Remember, sodium is Na+. So it pumps in potassium while also pumping out sodium. This protein is going to be one of the most important that you study. And it is called the sodium-potassium pump.
One important job that the sodium-potassium pump has is to set up concentration gradients across the cell membrane.
But because it requires active transport, we need to get some energy to be able to do this. That's because outside the cell already has a high concentration of sodium ions. And inside the cell already has a high concentration of potassium ions. And what this means is that both of these ions are moving against their concentration gradient. So there was already a high concentration of sodium outside the cell, and we pushed more sodium in there. And there was already a high concentration of potassium inside the cell, and we pull more in there. That's why we need some kind of an energy source. We know that energy source is going to be ATP. So what happens is that ATP is on the inside of the cell. We have an ATP. Remember, that is adenosine triphosphate. So this ATP is going to come up to the protein pump. When it reaches the pump, it's going to lose a phosphate. That means it released energy, remember, from our last segment. And then, because it lost its phosphate, it is now ADP. So ATP traveled upwards to the sodium-potassium pump. It lost one of its phosphate groups, and because it lost a phosphate group, it broke that bond, therefore it released a great amount of energy. In fact, it released enough energy to pull in potassium against its concentration gradient and push out sodium against its concentration gradient. So it lost a phosphate. Now our ATP has become ADP. ADP is just adenosine diphosphate. And di just means two. So now we still have that nucleotide, but now we only have one phosphate to phosphate bond. So the protein pump needs energy directly. The sodium-potassium pump could not pull in potassium and push out sodium without the help of the energy that is released when we break a phosphate off of ATP. And when we lose a phosphate on adenosine triphosphate, we end up with adenosine diphosphate. And another reminder is that both of these things, sodium and potassium, are moving against their concentration gradient. They are moving from areas of low concentration to areas of high concentration. With secondary active transport, we still require energy, but that energy in the form of ATP is used indirectly. And what we mean by saying that ATP is used indirectly is that we must have primary active transport first. So without primary active transport occurring, we're not going to be able to get secondary active transport. So we're going to draw out an example of how primary and secondary active transport work together. So for primary active transport, we already know an example of how this occurs, and that is with the sodium-potassium pump. So I will make a simplified sketch version of the sodium-potassium pump over here. So as you can see, over here we have primary active transport because ATP is used directly. This ATP is necessary because it loses its phosphate and releases a great deal of energy, and that happens to be enough energy to pull in potassium against the concentration gradient and push out sodium against its concentration gradient. Over here, for secondary active transport, I have a more ovally shape. This is the sodium glucose co-transporter, also a protein. So we have our protein over here is a sodium-potassium pump, but our protein over here is a sodium glucose co-transporter. What that means, co-transport, co means together, is we're pulling sodium and glucose into the cell together. So with this, sodium moves back into the cell, and because we forced it out here, using energy, it's going to already want to come back in. So now our sodium is moving down its gradient. And that's a great thing, because when sodium moves through this sodium glucose co-transporter, guess what else moves across it? If you guessed the sugar glucose, you would be correct. So in the long run, by doing this, we're saving ourselves ATP, because with one molecule of glucose, we can get upwards of 20 molecules of ATP. And we only had to use one in order to bring it in. The sodium-potassium pump required a molecule of ATP because it is primary active transport. The sodium glucose co-transporter did not require ATP. But the cotransporter did rely on sodium gradient. Remember, sodium is that Na+, created by the sodium-potassium pump. And because of this reliance, we say that this is secondary active transport.